I want to welcome you to the new school and to this event. I want to begin by apologizing for being about to do the dean kind of thing, which is to have to run off to a meeting with other deans rather than being here for the discussion, which is something I'd way rather do. This is a fascinating and important forum. This event is right in the sweet spot of the traditions and values of our institution. For nearly a century, since we were founded in 1919, the New School's been committed to New York, to integrating our educational work with dealing with the most important social issues, issues of policy, social change, and social justice, and to having robust, creative public programs that engage significant public policies as part of our educational work. We've always seen the New School as not just an educational institution, but a kind of public sphere, a forum for advocacy and debate and collective deliberation on matters of public import. And today's event on high school choice and educational policy is in that very best tradition. And the fact that it is being sponsored by the Center for New York City Affairs, part of the Milano School in our division, is doubly appropriate and doubly important. Milano has the mission of training students in management and public policy to be advocates, policymakers, change makers across a whole set of very, very important issues. Our students and our faculty see themselves as integrating scholarship and practice, as bringing the gifts and capacities of study in the university and research to bear on the most important issues. And the Center for New York City Affairs is an especially important space for that kind of work. As all of you know, because you are here, it's an absolutely essential center mixing collective discussion of issues and public communications and advocacy about the health of neighborhoods, about the well-being of children and families, about the city as a whole. And education is an especially important part of the portfolio of issues that the Center for New York City Affairs engages. So we're delighted that you were here. We're delighted to sponsor this event and to support it and welcome it. It's in our best traditions, and I know, unfortunately, I take on faith rather than being part of it, that the discussion will be important, significant, and collaborative. And with that, I want to turn the podium over to my colleague, Andrew White, the director of the Center for New York City Affairs, and welcome all of you.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody. On a school holiday, vacation week, and all that. It's strange to be talking about public schools, but it means more of you could be here, I hope. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an applied policy research center within the Milano School, and it's dedicated to improving the effectiveness of government and its partner agencies working in working class and low-income neighborhoods in New York City. We work on research, policy analysis, public dialogue, strategic planning, coalition building, and more. And for the last 3 years, we've been working on issues surrounding the city's reform efforts in the public schools. We've produced research on chronic absenteeism, school accountability, the development of small high schools, and choice, among other things. You can find those papers and much more on our website at centernyc.org. All of this work has required a lot of staff and resources, and most notably, I want to point to Kim Nauer, who's running the education project, and Clara Hemphill, who oversees Inside Schools and also works on our education policy work. Clara is going to moderate today's panel. I also want to thank our funders on the Schools Watch project, which include the United Way of New York City, the Cyrus Fund, the Ira W. DeCamp Foundation, the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, the Donors Education Collaborative, and New York Community Trust. And this forum and discussion is most especially supported by the Trust. So as many of you know very well, New York City is the site of a huge experiment in school choice, with more than 1 million school children and more than 1,700 public schools. There's nothing else like this anywhere in the country, or anywhere for that matter. Nearly 300,000 teenagers are attending high schools in New York City. In 2009, we published a report titled The New Marketplace that described the impact of the school choice system on young people who attended different types of high schools. We noted the advantages and the disadvantages of the rapidly expanding number of small high schools, and we described the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of the city's school choice system and its methods. And among all of that, within all of that, was this notable quote from Chancellor Joel Klein, or then Chancellor Joel Klein. Quote, "I'm always looking at the fact that people seem to want certain schools and not other schools," he told us. "That's one of the indicators I take into account when I make decisions about closing schools. It's basically a supply and demand pattern. This is about improving the system, not necessarily about improving every single school." So as you'll hear in a minute, most young New Yorkers select a list of high schools they hope to attend when they're 13 years old, and the large majority get into one of their choices. What we weren't able to do in that study, other than looking at the philosophy and the way it's playing out in the small schools and large schools and neighborhood schools and those that young people travel long distances to attend, what we weren't able to do was look inside that black box of the school selection process itself. And that's what Sean Corcoran has been able to do with his recent research, which we're going to hear about this morning. So here's how the rest of this program will proceed. First, we're going to hear an opening presentation from Sean describing the findings in his research. And it's very specifically about the high school choice process. And then out of that, Clara will come up and moderate a conversation with the panel. We're going to talk about these research findings, but also go more broadly into the larger questions of high school choice and how it's playing out in New York City. And then towards the last half hour, we'll have time for questions and thoughts from all of you, or many of you. So I'm very pleased now to introduce Sean Corcoran, Associate Professor of Educational Economics at New York University's Steinhardt School and at the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Sean's working on a retrospective assessment of the Bloomberg-Klein reforms to school choice and competition in New York City for the American Institutes of Research, American Institutes for Research, I mean. And what we're about to hear is part of that larger project. Sean.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to kick off this conversation with some of the findings from a research project that I conducted with Hank Levin of Columbia Teachers College. It actually was published very recently in this book that I'm sure you can find in a bookstore near you, or perhaps not, called Education Reform in New York City. It's from the Harvard Education Press. Choice is just but one of the topics covered in this book, and so I highly recommend this new book volume. And as you'll see, this is what I would call a bird's eye view of the high school choice process and its outcomes. So as Andrew said, the Bloomberg and Klein administration significantly changed the landscape of high school choice in New York City. They instituted a new system of high school choice in 2004, which required eighth graders to rank up to their top 12 preferred high school programs. There's a centralized matching system that assigns students to one high school. The district eliminated many of the traditional attendance zones, closed many large comprehensive high schools, introduced new small high schools, charter schools, and also brought about a new culture of accountability, providing more information about the available schools and promoting more transparency in the whole process. And I think these two quotes summarize the philosophy quite well. The first, we are giving parents more quality choices for their children, along with timely information to help them make good choices. And then second, the quote from Joel Klein in 2009, it's not about a great school system, it's about a system of great schools. So assessing whether or not the system works, whether or not the school choice system is working for the kids of New York City, is a pretty complex task because school choice has lots of varied objectives. Number one, it's designed to promote opportunities for students who are traditionally in low-performing or racially or economically isolated schools. Second, it's to provide a better match of students to high schools, to find a school that best suits their needs. It's also designed to provide incentives for schools to perform highly. So as Andrew said, if demand is low for a school, that may be a signal that something is not going well in that particular school. And also to encourage innovation on the part of schools. It's also there to engage parents in the process and to empower them and bring them into the process of choosing a school. It's to respect parents' freedom of choosing a school, and then we hope ultimately to improve academic outcomes and graduation rates. So if we hope to learn whether or not choice is working for New York City's kids, we have to be sure that we're asking the right questions. It's not just a question of whether the system is working or not working, but a series of related questions. So number one, what schools are available to kids, and how has this changed over time? I don't know why that skipped to number 3, but number 2, the options, number 1 is the options, sort of what schools are actually on the menu for kids. And number 2 is the preferences. So once something's on the menu doesn't necessarily mean people are going to order it. Where students say that they want to enroll or that they're willing to enroll. Number 3, number 5, what influences these choices? So what determines the schools that kids want to attend or are willing to attend? So here I'm thinking about their preferences, their parents' input, their peers, the role of geography, transportation, information, school resources, guidance counseling, and the list goes on and on. Number 4 is just the question of where do students end up at the end of the day? Are they placed in one of their top choices? And as we've heard, many students do receive one of their their first choice or their top 3 choices. 5th, I'm losing count here, the individual impacts on students. So does school choice actually improve student achievement for what students? Does it promote more engagement on the part of students? Does it raise their satisfaction, their safety? Does it improve or keep reasonable, at least, their travel time? And then lastly, what are the systemic effects of the school choice program? Is choice the tide that lifts all boats and gets all schools to perform at a higher level? Or does school choice simply promote more cream skimming and raise stratification of students across different schools? So as I said, my analysis is a very high level, what I call a bird's eye view of the high school choice process. It's really some baby steps in the direction of trying to understand the outcomes of this process. I'm looking at inputs, which are students' choices, and then outcomes of the process where students are ultimately placed. And there's a lot of steps, as you know, along the way, and that's a task for another day. So in this presentation, I'm going to look briefly at how many schools students apply to, what schools are students' top choices. I'm not going to name names, but I'll provide characteristics of students' top choices. 3, where students are ultimately matched. And I want to emphasize that these are important questions both on average, so for the city's students as a group, but also for specific subgroups, so traditionally low-achieving students, students of different socioeconomic backgrounds, by different race and gender, neighborhood, immigrants, special needs, and so on. So one of the most enlightening components of this project for me was simply learning how this process works. I don't have kids in the system, no kids at all. I haven't gone through the process myself, and I don't envy those of you that have gone through this process. It's very complex, and so it took me a while to get my head around how the process works. So this is my attempt to boil down the timeline of the choice process for 8th graders. And this picture usually evokes 2 reactions from the audience. So half usually chuckle because it looks so Byzantine and complex, and then the other half chuckle because they think it's actually oversimplifying the process, and that I've made it look a lot more easier and streamlined than it actually is. But either way, I think this picture shows that students have a lot of choices to make along the way. So these are some of the choices that I've identified as critical along the way in forming what I call a choice set being the set of schools that kids are considering and also applying to. So there's the decision about whether or not to take the specialized high school exam and to apply for one of the specialized schools, which many students do. The issue of what high schools should be considered at all, or which schools are actually on the radar screen, and what schools meet my needs and interests as a student. The question of how many schools should I rank. So you can rank up to 12 high school programs. You do rank programs rather than schools. And there are up to 700 programs now in the city. Does it make sense to fill out the full form and write in 12 choices or a smaller number? That's a decision that's made. And the best mix of choices. Should I mix screen selected programs in with less selected programs, and how should those be balanced? What order should I rank the choices? How selective should I be? or how selective should my school choices be? And also, am I eligible for admissions? So as many of you know, the high school programs each have their own admissions methods and admissions priorities. And so a student and his or her family needs to be aware of what those admissions methods are. So I don't have time to run through all the different options, but there are screened programs, there are unscreened, so-called limited unscreened programs, traditional zone schools, the educational option programs, which give a mix of students at different academic levels, and so on. And then there's, on the left, you sort of see the variety of types of high schools that kids can consider. Here's just a picture of how the availability of these programs have changed over time. So most of the programs have remained fixed, at least in terms of numbers. The audition schools, for example, the zoned schools have gone down by a little bit. Unscreened schools have declined by a little bit. But the biggest increases come from the limited unscreened programs, many of which are located in the Bronx that came about with the closure of large high schools. And you also notice a decline in the number of educational option programs in recent years as well. So one of my big questions for this project was to look at students' choice sets. So what choices are students making? So I'm going to provide some evidence, and I have lots of good stuff here, so I'm going to move kind of rapidly, but these slides are also going to be available online so that you can go back and take a look at them. So the city's specialized high schools long predate the new high school choice process, but they're still a very important part of the landscape, and they're certainly what a lot of people like to talk about. As you can see from this picture, close to 30% of all students apply for the specialized high schools, and this number is as high as 60% for the students of Asian backgrounds in the city, and those ranking in the top third on the 7th grade math exam. And that number declines down to 17 and 15% for our city's Hispanic students and recent immigrants. So a lot of students are applying to the specialized schools. Not many get in. About 6% overall are admitted, and you can see how this varies considerably across different subgroups of students in the city. So applying to specialized high schools is an important decision. It also affects the composition of schools down the road. Here's a picture of the number of schools that students are ranking on their form. I really had no idea what to expect going into this, but one thing that you see from this is a lot of students do fill out the full form, so 22% are listing 12 schools, but the vast majority of students don't fill out a total of 12 schools, and you see kind of a wavy pattern here where there's 7% of kids that are filling out only one choice on their form, then that drops and then rises back up again, and it's sort of an even distribution between 6 and 11. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Most importantly is this is related to your likelihood of being placed. And so the more choices you put on the form, the more likely you are to get a successful match in the first round. And so I can talk later about this dip from 1 to 2, but you can see that putting down more choices makes a lot of sense. The number of choices vary in some interesting ways across subgroups of students. So traditionally, there's a typo here, I'll explain in a second. But traditionally, sort of disadvantaged kids tend to put more choices on their high school choice form. So for example, kids that are eligible for free lunch put an average of 8 schools on their choice form. But then down at the bottom of the list, you'll see kids in the top 2% and kids in the bottom and top should be switched. That's a mistake. The kids in the top 1/3 put fewer choices on average. A lot of this just has to do with geography and the availability of schools. So you can see that the average number of ranked choices varies a lot across boroughs of the city, with the kids in Manhattan and Bronx listing the most choices on this form. So one thing that I hate to make a generalization from the results in the chapter because it's a very complicated story, but one thing that emerges is that along a number of dimensions, students seem to have high ambitions for their first choice schools. So if you look at kids' first choice schools, there's some common elements to that I think you'll see in the next few slides. So one is that screen programs, the more selective programs, are the most frequent first choice pick among kids. So 38% of kids in the city, at least in 2008, listed a screen program as their number one choice. And the second most popular was in the educational option programs. but those have declined as those number of programs have declined. And this is not just really among select kids in the city. This is really pretty common across the board to list a screen program as your first choice. Another way in which the first choice is sort of reflects high ambitions is the demand for the schools that students list as their first choice. It's hard to come up with a good measure of demand, but if you look at the number of first choice rankings that a school program received and divide by the number of kids who actually are ultimately placed in that program, you get a sense of at least the popularity of that program among kids as a first choice. And you see that on average, kids are ranking first to fairly popular schools that receive almost 2.5 first choice rankings per available seat. But that also varies a lot across subgroups of students. And so some of the top performing kids in the city tend to are most likely to list selective programs, the most selective programs in the city as their top choice. But kids at the bottom of the academic distribution, and also recent immigrants, Hispanic students, are putting programs that are in much less demand as their first choice. I chose an unfortunate word. Unsubscribed is probably not the best way to describe this metric, but this is looking at whether or not kids' first choice school received fewer first choice rankings than there were seats. So it's reflecting that it was a relatively unpopular program among kids in the choice process. And you see the opposite pattern. So it tends to be the more disadvantaged kids are more likely to list a program first that is relatively, quote, undersubscribed. There are lots and lots of interesting other dimensions of schools that we could look at in terms of kids' first choice. For example, are they ranking small schools as their top choice, large schools? Location, how far are they willing to go? The racial concentration and socioeconomic composition of the school, the level of achievement and mix of kids in the school, safety. I certainly can't look at all of these in the chapter or in this presentation, but these are all really interesting dimensions. First of all, on school size, if you look at small versus large schools, there is certainly a variation in preferences for small schools across subgroups in the cities. And so this is ranked by the percent listing a small school as their first choice. You see the opposite pattern among these groups in preferring a larger school. And again, I'm going to come back to this important element of geography and available schools. That some of this just reflects the availability of schools in the borough. Another interesting thing that you see is the racial and socioeconomic composition of students' most preferred school. So these bars are actually the percentage of kids with the same characteristic in your middle school. So for example, the average white student in 8th grade is attending a middle school that's 41% white, and similar interpretations of the other bars. So this is the characteristic of the middle school. And then the red bar here is the characteristic of their first choice school. So you can see that, at least in these groups, that white and Asian students primarily are choosing schools that look very similar to the feeder school or 8th grade school that they attend. But the Black, Hispanic, and kids eligible for free lunch, at least in their first choice school, are seeking out schools that are a little less racially concentrated or with a lower fraction of kids of low income. I'm going to return to that picture later on in the presentation. Here's a picture of the preferences for academics, and here this is not a measure of school quality, but just a measure of the average academic ability of the kids that are in the school. So this is the blue bar again represents the kids' middle school, and the red bar represents the first choice high school. And so again, you see sort of high ambitions with the first choice in the sense that kids are trying to attend a school that has kids with higher academic achievement than the middle school that they attended. And really that's true for all of these groups. And I'll return to that picture as well. By the city's school progress report, you see there's variation in first choice rankings of schools that received an A versus a C through F. So these vary in systematic ways. That's the blue bar is A's. The red bar is schools receiving a grade C to F. I've mentioned the importance of geography. So a lot of the slides you might be reading, you might say, well, this really just has to do with kids applying to schools that are in their neighborhood, and I think that's very true. So a lot of what we're seeing here really reflects geographic constraints, people's willingness to travel, and also their preferences, their desire to attend a school that's not far from home. So we did a cursory analysis of how far kids are willing to go for their first choice school and their top 3 schools. And we're looking at the zip code that kids live in and their first choice school. First of all, the vast majority of kids rank first a school that's in their own borough. So leaving the borough is not that common, although the kids in Brooklyn and the Bronx are most likely to rank a school outside of those boroughs. This is a picture of how far away the first choice school was from the kids' residence. And so the colors are confusing me, but the dark blue line is all students. And so you see that, something close to 36% of kids are ranking first a school that's within a mile of their home zip code, which in New York City can encompass a lot of ground, but it's also relatively close to home. And the average distance was about 2.5 miles to the first choice school. That varied across groups where English language learners, for example, were only wishing to travel up to 2 miles for their first choice school. Okay, so I'm going to run tight on time, so let's look at where kids are ultimately placed. First of all, as has been said, most kids do get placed in the first round of the process. Currently, 2008 was the last year of data that I was looking at. 92% were placed in the first round of matching. This has been rising slowly over time. It does vary across groups, but most groups have a good chance of getting placed then. A smaller percentage are placed in the supplemental round. I can talk about this later, but the supplemental round, from what I'm seeing, is not a good place to be because students are a lot less likely to get one of their top choices in that round because this number of seats available is pretty slim. So this is the percent of kids that are actually getting their first choice. This is in 2008. It was about 53%. It varies across groups, but not dramatically. And this is the percent receiving their top 3 choices, so it's relatively high. But I do want to emphasize, and we can talk about this during the panel, that receiving a top choice is a good thing. That we want kids to get the school of their choice. But this metric also has many complicated interpretation because it really reflects the kinds of schools that kids are applying to as well. So returning to this preference for socioeconomic and racial mix, this was the picture you saw before, the preferences for kids of the same racial background or socioeconomic status. And then the green bar here is where the kids ended up. So when you see Black and Hispanic kids are kids eligible for free and reduced price lunch, the school that they are ultimately placed in looks a little closer to the school that they started in than in their first choice, but it's not as concentrated as the feeder school that they attended. This is the story with academic outcomes. These are, again, where kids started and then their number 1 choice, and this is where they ended up. So kids tended to end up in schools that were lower achieving than their first choice and closer to their feeder school or middle school. Kids also ended up attending school closer to home than their preferences indicated, so the ultimate placement is even closer to home than their first choice. So what influences these preferences and choices? I think this is where we have a lot to learn, and I want to just highlight a couple of studies that are coming out of NYU. A couple of our top PhD students have been doing ethnographic observations and qualitative research in the city schools, doing interviews of students, parents, school personnel, conducting large surveys. And there's some interesting things that emerge from this that we can talk about. Differences, for example, between immigrant and native students in their approach to choice, where we see that those with integrated homeschool and peer support tended to be more organized, targeted, and also more successful in the process. And those without that guidance did not develop such criteria and were less successful. One of the things that emerges from both of these studies is that I found really interesting is that oftentimes parents are not necessarily the top decision maker in this process, and in many families the decision is really pushed to the student level. And again, these kids are 13 years old and often given that responsibility of making an informed choice. So the same was true in the second study that we can talk about as well. one other thing to highlight before I leave this slide is this idea of negative choice and the idea of equating good schools with good neighborhoods. There was in this study there was more kids and more families that were saying where the kids shouldn't go rather than where they should go. So you should not go to that school over there because we think that school is bad, but anything else is fine. Or the idea of equating, again, good schools with a good or safe neighborhood, which I think is an interesting observation. Okay, so I'll conclude by providing some what I think are some key points from what we've learned. So under this new system, the Department of Education operates as kind of a market facilitator. They're making lots of information available, as we saw in the quote, to parents and kids. They're coordinating, they're standardizing enrollment, making it a lot more transparent. They're also aiding in creating new schools, closing schools where appropriate. But I think one of the things that's emerging from this and studies of school choice elsewhere is that information is not necessarily just sufficient. So just saying the information is out there is not going to take you all the way. And success is going to depend very heavily on parents and kids' access to information, their use of information, how well they understand the process, their own preferences, their constraints, their willingness to travel, that kind of thing. Certainly high school choice is empowering, but it's also very complex. As you've seen in these very simple pictures today, there's systematic differences across student groups and choices and their ultimate outcomes, and we need to understand a lot more about why this arises. I think this geography issue is a really important issue. Choices, preferences, placements are likely to be very close to home, suggesting that we should be very focused on accessibility to nearby quality schools and not necessarily making kids travel very far for access to a good school. And also that the stratification across middle schools is likely to persist into high schools. And I put it this way, sort of a truism is it's impossible for everyone to go to a better school than your middle school. And by better, I mean sort of better composition of kids, higher achieving kids, fewer kids with more difficult needs. Not everyone can improve their lot necessarily. We have the kids that we have, so while aspirations are high, I think that's the reason why you see kids sort of fall back towards their middle school. And so I'll close again with a quote that it's really not about a great school system, it's about a system of great schools, and I would add great accessible schools. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. So if you're like me, the first time through that, you probably picked out about half of the really key points. Happily, we now have an hour, more than an hour, to glean the rest of it, because there's a lot of rich material there to unpack, and a lot that it sort of opens up in terms of broader conversation. Last summer, the Center for New York City Affairs was lucky enough to get a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to bring InsideSchools.org into the fold and make it a project of the center. And the getting that grant made it possible to reunite the core group that had created that website in the first place. It was Clara Hemphill, Pam Wheaton, and Jackie Wayans. And Clara has been at the center now for a couple of years, so now she's dividing her time between running Inside Schools and working on the policy projects and trying to find the sort of great spaces where we can do both together. So we're lucky to have Clara to guide us through this discussion, and she will introduce the rest of the panel. Clara.
Well, first we'll call up Sean, who you've all met. He's a NYU economist and professor at Steinhardt School at NYU, and he's written extensively on school choice. Arlene Benjamin Gomez is a lawyer for Advocates for Children who has written a lot about how immigrants navigate the school choice process and what effect they've had on, what effect the new schools, the new small schools have had on English language learners. We have Carol Boyd, who's who's taken part in school choice for 50 years now, As a child, she was part of the open enrollment process, which allowed kids of color to leave segregated schools and go to mostly white schools. She went from Harlem to Riverdale as an elementary school student. Then her children and now her grandchildren are also taking part in school choice, and I think it'll be an interesting perspective to see whether, how things have changed. We have Rob Sanft, who is head of enrollment for the Department of Education. He's also attended public schools himself as a child, which gives him a lot of street cred, and went to Mark Twain Gifted and Talented Middle School in Coney Island and Midwood High School. And what gives him even more street cred is that he sends his own children to PS 154 in Windsor Terrace. We also have Carolyn Satin-Bajav, who is a graduate student who works with Sean at NYU. She also worked for the Department of Education in the Office of Multiple Pathways, met her husband in the Office of Accountability. Who knew? And she's doing her PhD thesis on how different ethnic groups navigate school choice. So I really want to thank you all for coming. It's really gives us a 360-degree view of the school system. Sean, I just want to have you clarify some of your findings. The things that I noticed most about your presentation is that Black and Latino kids tend to apply to a lot of schools, and they have very high aspirations, but they tend to end up in schools that look a lot like their middle schools. Does that mean school choice has failed for them?
I think that would be hard to conclude certainly from the work that I've done so far. I think the more I got into it, the more complicated the story was, and the more that geography seemed to matter. And so that so you have a small number of schools and school programs that are receiving really a disproportionately large number of first choice votes. So there's a small number of very popular programs that kids are aiming for, and you see that in the pictures. But not everyone can get into those programs, and so kids end up in a school that tends to be close to where they live, as you saw, and does tend to look a lot like the school that they had at their middle school. And so it's complicated, especially when you look at first choices, because as anyone's gone through the college process, not everyone gets their first choice, and so you can see the aspirations there, but it's not everyone can get into a small number of really selected programs.
Would you say things have changed a lot, or not very much in the last 8 years?
Under the new system versus the old system, yeah. I was not here during the old system, so maybe I'd like to hear some others on the panel talk about that. I think the process is, from what I understand, is a lot more transparent than it used to be. There's certainly the mandatory aspect of it is a mixed blessing in the sense that it forces everyone to get involved, but it also forces everyone to be informed, which presents a new set of challenges.
Guidance counselors then are really critical to the process.
Absolutely, and I think that's one thing that came out of the qualitative research that we looked at that I mentioned. Guidance counseling is extremely important, especially for certain groups where parents are pushing the decision down to the kids.
Well, that leads me a little bit to Carolyn's research. You interviewed parents and children of different ethnic groups as they went through the high school process. What surprised you the most about your research?
Well, there's so many surprising things, but I looked at different ethnic groups, but really just wanted to understand. I began by wanting to understand what it's like to be a child of immigrants going through the process, and comparing it to low income and comparing it to other low income native born kids and families. And because I've lived in the world of Latin American immigration during my doctoral studies, I came in thinking that this idea of that the research has shown that many low-income Latin American immigrant parents think that academic decisions belong with the school because they're the experts, and I'm an expert in raising a moral child and doing sort of the moral education at home. So I thought when I talked to parents, they were going to assume that their child was getting help to make these choices for high school. And what I found was some parents didn't know that choices were even happening, and parents who didn't expect that their child was getting, they never even brought up, oh, the teacher's going to help them. Oh, they thought my 8th grader can make this choice. Or, and even more surprising, it doesn't matter what school my child goes to, because if I do my job as a parent and raise a good kid, then he or she is going to do well wherever he ends up, which was pretty shocking to me, especially when I juxtaposed it with the upper and middle class white parents I interviewed who said things like, I thought I was having a heart attack. I thought my kid would get killed if he goes to this school. They were looking to move to Long Island. It was a the extent to which the narratives from parents differed really blew me away. And so from the theoretical perspective on, it wasn't, oh, you're getting the support at school, so I'm not doing it. It was, you're old enough, and in the end, it doesn't really matter. Why? One high-performing kid in the middle school where I did my research, his older brother had gone to the local zone school, finally managed to get out after 5 years, and he wanted to go to a higher-performing, his number one was a higher-performing school 45 minutes away. And his parents could not understand why he's going to have to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning. Why doesn't he just go around the corner? So it was just that was pretty surprising. And then we can talk later about guidance, and I'd love to talk to Rob about your thoughts on guidance. But it wasn't the guidance that I think the kids would need in the absence of the parental support wasn't in place in a few of the schools that I spent time in.
So you found that the guidance was a critical part, that a lot of this...
Well, it wasn't a critical part because it didn't exist. I think it could be a critical part.
Well,
yeah, I'm not, and it is really hard to explain why. So one of my theories of what happened at the school level was in the era of accountability where schools and teachers and principals are under so much pressure, something has to go. So what's easier to go is something that you're not being held accountable for. So in my ethnography, and it's one middle school, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, SES, the Supplementary Education Services, which was a way for students to get additional support to hopefully have better academic outcomes. They talked about it all the time. At every meeting, at any time, at an open house, the principal got over the loudspeaker and in English and Spanish, come to the cafeteria. They were making phone calls at home so that kids would turn in their SES forms so they would get extra tutoring. But high school choice, and I don't necessarily have a great proposal for how we're going to hold schools accountable. I don't want to add more to their plate. But high school choice, they weren't evaluated in any way. So it was really up to the school what they did in terms of information. The guidance counselors knew that the DOE could see the number of appeals their kids requested and if they got the applications in on time. But other than that, it was really up to them. So from one year to the next, one year this middle school had a large, generally well-attended event for parents where they explained it. They did a PowerPoint, 200 parents came, and then the next year, nothing happened. They didn't, and I kept asking, oh, when's the event? And they said, oh, he's planning it, she's planning it, the principal's busy. It just didn't happen. And then in the year that there was a good event, a middle school that got an A on its progress report had a really poorly planned event, but they had an A on their progress report. And the other accountability sort of tidbit was that the learning environment survey is another way that schools are held accountable. So from the same 1 year period, the middle school that I did my research in, they did a lot more the second year to get more response on the learning environment survey. And all of the assistant principals, the paras, everyone knew about the learning environment survey, and we're doing incentives for kids to turn them in. And the same thing wasn't true for the high school choice. So it sort of fell off the radar because they were under so much pressure, I thought, for other things.
And when I was talking to Sean on the phone before this, he was surprised that a lot of kids were putting down 12 choices, and you wondered whether, in fact, they'd really researched 12 different schools. Carolyn, you found that some parents were visiting 35 schools, and some were visiting none.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
That's another extreme example of I think first-time upper middle class white parents who were extremely nervous. In the end, the parents I spoke to, there were probably only 10 schools they'd be willing to let their child go to anyway. It was the same 10, but we need to do everything. And there was a woman who said, I took the night shift, so I would spend nights looking on the internet, and I would email what I found in the morning, and my friend who wakes up early would email me, and she'd do the research. And we started in the spring the year before, and I had my spreadsheet, and then there are other parents. And another sort of question about choice is how to evaluate success and how the DOE evaluates success. Getting your first ranked school doesn't necessarily mean that a kid did a lot of research, because some of the students I saw who didn't, especially the recent immigrants, didn't turn in their application. So the guidance counselor put down their zone school, it was their first choice, and they got it. So
Yeah.
What does that mean for
Yeah, could I jump in there? And I'm really glad that Carolyn brought up the idea of accountability here, because I think that's important, because this is a really critical process. But I think we also have to think very hard about what accountability should look like. So there are probably a lot of wrong ways to go about doing accountability for the choice process. So one is kids getting their first choice school, or kids turning in their forms, because there's a lot of ways that can happen and not necessarily produce a good match for a kid, or a good outcome for that kid. And so, as you said, I mean, a kid could go to the worst school in the neighborhood and get guaranteed to get in, and that might look good for the accountability statistics for the school, but it's not necessarily the outcome we want for the kid. And so there's probably a smart way to
right?
do
Well,
that.
and I think we're sort of also in a time where it's so output focused, which makes sense. I think the pendulum has swung from a lot of inputs. And this might be a situation where we do need to focus on inputs at the middle school. Just saying that we've done 3 outreach events, 1 in 6th grade, 1 in 7th grade, 1 in 8th grade, or a minimum number, so that there is some degree of accountability. But you can't, in the end, if a kid chooses a low-performing school, you can't hold the middle school accountable for that. So it makes it complicated.
It's very tough.
Carol Boyd, I'd like to ask you some questions. You've participated in this process both as a parent, and you're college educated, and you've been able to use your education to help your own children. And also in your advocacy work at New Settlement, you help more disadvantaged children through the high school process. Tell me what the difference is there.
Big difference. According to Carolyn's statistics, I would be white. And so would my partner in crime, Ronette Summers. In fact, we dub ourselves the Clara Hemphill and Kim Wayans of the urban school choice system, because we work largely, we recognized that there was a great divide, and that children who came home to parents who at least were functionally literate were way ahead of those that didn't. And the high school directory, how can your parent navigate it if he or she doesn't read or write in any language? So what I actually did for one of our local middle schools, which is now unfortunately on the persistently lowest achieving list, was I redid the high school directory, scaled it down, turned it into a PowerPoint with animations, lots of pictures, and instead of all that type that is in the big book, simplified it to catchy phrases. Then we had it translated into Spanish. The school is still using it this year. I didn't have to go there, and the outcomes have improved. First of all, you have to understand.
I'm sorry, how do you know the outcomes have improved?
Through constant contact. That's one of the schools that New Settlement aligns itself with, so we're always in there. Our members serve on their school
So the
leadership
outcomes
team.
have improved in the sense that the kids are going to better schools?
Yes, and parents are becoming less fearful about school choice. One of the things I found with immigrant parents and other parents of color for wanting to keep their children closer to home is fear. Because I hear from my own child who travels roughly 11 miles to school every day, and he wouldn't have it any other way, is that they are oftenly and frequently stopped by the police. So to have this not be an issue, a parent, and you can't blame them, wants to keep his or her child close to home. But in doing that, you're often limiting the possibilities and for that child. My young guy has been going to school out of district since he was in grade 4. He attended school in District 2, asked quickly to get off of the school bus, said he could navigate the subway with friends that he formed, and he did it. And when it came time to go to high school, I first took him to a meeting in grade 6. I was like, why am I here? And it was interesting. There were less than 10 parents when the department sent out. He couldn't connect to high school choice in the 6th grade. But as it got closer and we began to visit more, and then he began to wrap his head around it, it was interesting. I said, so what would you like? So he gave me what he needed in a school. And I went, oh, this kid's out of his mind. He said, it needed to be small. He says, like you say, I'm a Cheers kind of kid. I need to be where everyone knows my name. And if you met him, you would know why. He says, it needs to have performing arts, because I am the next Bill T. Jones. And he is. He said, it needs to have a swimming pool. And it needs to be in Manhattan. I said, Zachary, sounds like you don't want to go to school. He goes, ha ha, you figured that out, right? However, with time, lots of time, we were able to find exactly such a school where everyone knows his name. He is getting premier dance instruction. It's in Manhattan, close to Soho where he can shop. And it's been very, very productive for him. And he wouldn't have it any other way and thinks that the 11-mile ride is well worth the trip.
Well, this is more optimistic view than I was honestly expecting from your discussion. And your PowerPoint, I hope you'll share it with us so we can put it on the Inside Schools website. One of the things we're trying to do is make the school choice system more accessible. So you say that even for the parents who don't speak English very well or don't read very well, that school choice can work if the information is...
If someone can, one, garner the parents together and explain the process step by step, and then assist the guidance staff in having one-on-ones with parents and children. Because lots of parents are, I went to that school, so you're going there. But that is not who your child may be. I have 2 children. If I were to flip their schools, they wouldn't have had the same positive outcomes. What works for Zach doesn't work for Sierra, and what worked for Sierra didn't work for Zach. And parents have to recognize that sometimes it's not about what's doing best for you. You're not the one in the classroom. It's what's doing best for that child. So we made our decision together.
Do you think things have changed for the better since you were a child yourself in terms of school choice?
There's more of them on the menu, like Mr. Corcoran said. However, my children say it's like going into a restaurant with a big menu like in TGIF. They said, and discovering that everything you want is sold out. So just because it's there doesn't mean that you're going to get it. And the problem is that the admissions priorities section of the directory, well, you needed to be a computer scientist to navigate it. It was torturous. Now they've simplified it, so parents didn't look at what the admissions priorities are. So even if your child has a 99 average in his or her District 9 school, chances of your getting into Millennium based on geographic location, et cetera, are slim and none. So you had to first navigate priorities. And I also explained, don't trust the school grade. And A doesn't mean that that school is the best school for your child. Even on not grade schools. We know they're based strictly on test scores. Inside schools is difficult for parents who aren't native speakers of the language. They don't often have computer access. So you have to bridge all of this and getting them to wrap their heads around school choice.
Arlen, that brings us up to the, Arlen's research has been on English language learners, and I hope you can talk a little bit about special education as well. Tell me a little bit about, I read your report about when Lafayette High School was broken up into small schools and what happened to new immigrants. Tell us a little bit about the new immigrant who I think was assigned to the High School of Sports Management.
Okay, maybe I'll just give a little framing first
Sure.
about kind of how we look at this issue. For students to really have choice, they have to be able to find a school that can meet their basic educational needs. And for English language learners and students with disabilities, this means something very different than for other student populations. It means a school that has ESL or bilingual education or dual language for an English language learner. And for a student with disability, it means a school that has a specialized program that can meet their unique needs. It could be anything from related services like speech therapy to a specialized class. So schools that don't have these basic services are not an option for English language learners and students with disabilities. So we've seen in the transformation from large schools to small schools that actually English language learners and students with disabilities have less options. Schools that have replaced these schools don't have the programs to meet their needs. So that extremely limits choice for these student populations. Information is key. You can't choose if you don't have the information. And as Carolyn was talking about, different people have access to very different information. The high school directory does list specialized classes and ELO programs. That information is often inaccurate. So schools will say they have an ESL class, but they don't have an ESL teacher. So I don't know how you have an ESL class without a teacher. And then the information is not always accessible for people who have limited literacy in their native language or in English, and people who speak other languages. So information is a key area that's lacking for these two populations as well. And then another thing that limits access for these student populations is that we're not clear about the protections that are in place in this system against discriminatory admissions practices. So when schools are choosing, not only parents and students are choosing schools, but schools are choosing students. And in that process, it's not clear to us what information are schools looking at about these student populations, and are they able to screen out English language learners and students with disabilities in that admissions practice. So that's another area that ends up limiting really the options for these students. And then finally, in order to have choice, you have to participate in the choice system. And we know that a lot of English language learners come after this whole choice process has happened and enroll over the counter. And so those kids end up being placed in the schools that still have seats open. And those are the less desirable schools, which tend to be the large schools, the persistently low achieving schools, or the brand new small schools that nobody really knows anything about them, so hasn't chosen them. So these four areas, I think, really limit choices for these student populations, which I think then when you say, okay, well, these students got their first choice, what does that actually mean? Because they've been, a guidance counselor has said to them, you have to pick a school that has an ELO program. You cannot pick a school that does not have an ESL or a bilingual program. Here's the schools that you can pick, and here's the school, and those schools you cannot pick. And we know from talking to students and talking to parents that that happens in schools. So I think, we've seen this transition of trying to create more options for students and create more choices, but for these two populations, it actually has worked in a way of limiting choices, and I think that there's some serious fixes that need to be done to our high school choice system so that these students can really have access to it.
Rob Samp, do you want to reply to that?
Here's where my street cred goes. So I think there are a number of things here, and I think Sean's points about us being market facilitators and information providers resonate, but I would be remiss if I didn't say we can always do more. We've improved since 2003, 2004, every year, and we figure out different ways to try and improve access to information, to improve the directory, to make some of the information more accurate, more simplified, but we absolutely have a long way to go. We need to figure out better ways to engage with specific communities. We need to figure out how to make information accessible to guidance counselors across the spectrum, and where there are no guidance counselors providing that information, figure out who does provide the information to those families and get them timely information. I would never tell you that we're 100% of the way there. We are not even close. We need to figure out how to get better information to families, and I want your PowerPoint too. Seriously, I mean, the ability to distill the information and apply it to specific communities is what we hope to achieve. We're just not there yet. With respect to English language learners and students with disabilities, I think Sean's research finds that some of these students actually receive their first choice in higher percentages than general ed students. And so what are the reasons behind that? Well, some of them could be, as you say, that guidance counselors are much more focused on managing expectations for these students. Is that always going to be the case, though? No, not necessarily. There are options available to these students. We continue to create options and figure out how to make those options more readily available. We continue to work with schools to figure out when it has been identified that a particular school doesn't have an ESL teacher, they have a basic obligation to provide those services. We need to get into that school and figure out how to make those services available. Students with disabilities have the right to apply across the spectrum of programs, and high schools are obligated to serve those students irrespective of the program that's identified on their IEP, whether it's related to services, a special class, whether it's an integrated co-teaching model. But the reality is, we need to make sure that the schools have the professional development and the resources to bring to bear to actually implement those programs. And we're largely responsive to that now, right? We need to make sure that we're out in front of it. And I think the reality is that research like Sean's, the research that Carolyn has done, is great because it points a finger, shines a spotlight directly on us. And we need that, right? We need to be responsive to that. We need to work with folks to figure out how to do things better. But ultimately, I think we've shown improvement. I think we can't rest on our laurels. We need to make sure that we're doing more.
You've heard the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished. One of the things that you did this year was you made the high school directory a lot better, and you put in the graduation rates for all of the schools. And surprise, surprise, most people decided they wanted their child to go to a school with a good graduation rate. So in fact, you had more kids who were shut out of all their top choices this year than last year. So is there a problem that if the more information you give, the freer the information, the more everybody piles up in the top 10 schools?
Is there a problem? There's a problem. We don't have enough good options to serve all New York City students, and we need to continue to improve that. The conversation we had immediately before this resonates. The supply isn't moving as quickly as the demand, and we need to focus on that. I mean, your point about the progress report information is important. We put the progress report information into the directory 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. I don't recall actually when. And so it did provide a level of information, but it didn't shift the way that students were applying to schools, absolutely. When we put the graduation rates in this past year, to your point, it really shifted the trend for certain schools.
Supply is meant to rise to reach the demand, but in the New York City public school system, the supply seems to outstrip the demand, not just at the high school level, but kindergarten wait lists. And do you have any theory on why that's the case?
So everyone likes to say, let's ask the economists. People ask me about their stock portfolios. Honestly, I don't know anything about that stuff. But I think Rob put it exactly right. I mean, the supply is lagging behind demand, and I mean, the fact is, it's a market-like choice system, but it's not a free-for-all market where the entry of new schools is very controlled. The closure of schools is very controlled, and so that's I think by nature it's going to be much more gradual. And I think just realizing that's where the bottleneck is that on the supply side will help us move policies in that direction towards pushing for more and better schools. So in other words, I mean, I can't recognize that there's a supply shortage in parts of the Bronx and move up there next week and start a new school. It's a much more controlled process, thankfully.
But Rob, I mean, you're also part of portfolio development. How do you respond when you see that there's a lot of demand for one kind of school and not another kind of school?
So I think first and foremost, the controlled way in which schools are open also doesn't automatically generate a buzz about that's where I'm definitely going to send my child, because there's a skepticism from the outset that says it's a new school. I want to see how it develops over a couple of years before I would consider sending my child there. So it takes a year, 2 years, 4 years before a community will say, you know, this is an option for us that we want our children to attend. And so over 8 years' time, you open a number of schools, and we've seen some of them be remarkably successful and others not so much. And so we need to reassess how success is measured for the schools, and ultimately whether or not some of the schools that we've opened can continue to persist the way that they do. We have the conversation consistently in our office that says if a school is low demand or does not fill for a certain number of years, do we need to look at that school from a different lens? Do we need to look at how students are gaining entrance to that school, whether it's screened or whether it's limited unscreened, and say, maybe we need to change this to provide greater opportunities for other families? I think there are a number of different things that go on here. The supply does lag behind the demand because it takes time for that supply to grow to the point where parents want to send their kids there. But where we don't realize success in any way that you measure it, we need to be reflective and say, we need to go back to the well on a particular school.
Carolyn, what was from talking to parents, what did they think about the small themed schools compared to the large neighborhood schools?
So there depends on the parents. And the parents from the low-income middle school that I did my research, there weren't that many small schools that people knew about, and it was mostly avoiding, like Sarah's research, avoiding some of the zone schools. Those parents didn't bring it up a lot. The other parents, the sort of higher income, native-born white parents, it depends. Some thought, it doesn't seem to me, and I was just surprised how much detail some of these parents understood about the system, that I don't think it makes sense to break up these large schools and aren't you doubling the administrative costs by you have all these different principals? And in the end, unless it was sort of a seal of approval school that everyone else was applying to and that had a good track record. So it was the same, in addition to, well, these parents, their kids did not want Stuyvesant. Bronx Science is now where this subset of parents that I talked to, all the kids want to go to Bronx Science, not Stuyvesant. It's too competitive, and then you can't get into college if you go to Stuyvesant. And then there's the issue of the priority. So if you're in District 2, you can do Eleanor Roosevelt and Millennium. And then there's Beacon, and now that in the lab school, it was just the same 10 schools, and few of them were new small schools. They didn't really sort of factor in because I don't think they have the track record, they don't have the cachet, they don't have, so that was.
And among the
themes, actually, in Sarah's research, the themes made a big difference to those families, at least on a very surface level. So the names mattered a lot.
Right.
So this school says technology. Well, my kid likes technology, and so that sounds good. And so
right.
From that standpoint, yeah. My favorite one, actually, from her research was that there's a school of, I forget the exact name, food and hospitality, and the line was, my kid likes to eat. This would be a very good school for them.
Well, for the students at the middle school, that was for sure. For the sort of students who couldn't get into the screen schools, I called them the regular track students. It was one of the only ways, in addition to location, one of the only ways to distinguish among so many programs. So first they saw that they couldn't get into, and maybe weren't interested in some of the higher performing screen schools. And so then you have to decide based on your interests. Oh, I like cosmetology, I like to do nails, I like to do hair, and my friend's going there. So themes are sort of a shortcut for kids to figure out what school. But their parents. There
was also a lot of confusion as well around school closures in a number of different ways. I remember this. I'm thinking of Sarah's research here, and hers was in the Bronx, where a lot of schools have closed. And there were cases where parents were just certain that the kid wanted to apply to a school a new school in the old building, and the parent would say, oh no, that school is closed. That school's been closed, and that's no longer an option for you. And also on the other side, sort of equating the new schools in a building with what that school used to be when they were a kid, or when when other kids were in school. That was a dangerous place. That was a bad school. You don't want to go there. And so there was a lot of confusion that, oh no, these are different schools in the same building.
And tell us again who Sarah.
Sarah Butler-Jessen, who couldn't be here, she also just had a baby within days. So she recently graduated with a PhD from Steinhardt.
Who benefits most from school choice? Anybody want to answer that? Carol.
Schools. School choice is definitely meant to create the best advantage for certain schools. And especially with the sexy designer names they have, it's very confusing to parents. And 13-year-olds who can barely remember their name, how can you leave school choice up to them? Mine deliberately said because he also added, and I forgot to mention, and they can't have metal detectors. You know, I don't like people touching me, and I have to be able to go out for lunch. That he thought it was the impossible task, but Mom did it, and it does exist. Like the English language learner schools you were mentioning. There are great high schools for ELs. However, most of those high schools, Gregorio Luperon in Washington Heights, Manhattan International, in the Julia Richmond complex, where both of my kids went to school at one time, they do amazing things. They're all screened schools. So if you're a newly arrived family and you see screened, that looks like barrier. Your status might be questionable, so the family is fearful, not realizing that your child's status has nothing to do with school choice. So schools really benefit.
I just want to interrupt. The Internationals Network actually do, you know, they are very good for those kids, and they do accept kids who are brand new to the country.
They certainly
the
do.
problem is there's only about, you know, there's only a couple thousand seats.
That's it.
Yeah. And that there are often no seats available at the middle of the year when somebody
There
comes
are
in.
none, because they're usually screened schools, so they don't take the over-the-counters.
Can I have
Yeah.
a question? Just, this is not to put you on the spot, legitimately interested. Given what, like, sort of the recognition to Rob that there are not enough desirable seats, in the context that you are working in, what are the goals of choice? So when the DOE frames it as choice and equity, what is the goal and how do you get there? I really mean it, though, because I want to be part of the solution.
I think Sean spoke to it a little earlier, but some of the goals are obviously to create greater transparency, to create greater access and equity. We realize that we have a long way to go with that. I mean, it's hard to answer your question about who benefits the most from a choice process, because students and schools benefit, but then there are always, in a choice process, which is a competitive marketplace, so to speak, and I realize that's a very cold way of describing it, there are going to be people who don't benefit from that marketplace. There are going to be schools that don't benefit. There are going to be students that don't necessarily benefit. I think the goal is to figure out how to maximize the schools that can be successful and replicate some of those models. But the bigger goal is to figure out how to ensure that the students who either traditionally or as choice has evolved over the last few years have not been served, have not had access, get that access to those seats. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to improve that strategically. How we do that, I think, is through partnership with probably half of the people in this room, through the people sitting at this table, and ultimately engaging in tough conversations and accepting criticism when it's warranted.
Arlen?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about not just, what has choice benefited students or not, but has the current choice system. I think that there are many people in the advocacy community that think choice is actually a really great thing. And it's been, I thought it was interesting in some of Sean's research talking about the history of choice in New York City, and that it's about integrating schools, it's about creating better access for students. And so I think we need to look at what our current choice system is and how can we make sure that it really is fair for everybody and that everybody really has access to that. And I think one thing I wanted to just throw out that people are looking into is a controlled choice system, which many school districts across the country have implemented, that looks at, you are matching schools and students, but you're also looking at what is the composition of each school and how are we integrating schools. So looking at socioeconomic status, looking at racial integration, looking at ELL status, looking at students with disabilities, and in the choice and matching system actually creating much more integrated schools. And that would be a way, I think, to really alleviate some of the issues that come out of the current choice system we have. I think there's huge policy implications for the fact that you have large numbers of English language learners that are ending up in these large schools that are that are persistently low achieving. What does that mean for that school's ability to be a successful school? It really challenges that school. And so if you can have a choice system that really doesn't put an excessive burden on certain schools and let other schools have the cream of the crop students, that part of the reason that our schools are struggling so much is this outcome of our choice system. And so how do we create a choice system that really integrates students more and allows students to go to schools that can meet their needs?
That's very interesting because the educational option schools, of course, and were designed in the 60s, the 70s. Judy's here. 70, thank you. Judy Baum, also an inside schooler and a resident historian of the school system. The educational option schools were set up with the design of having a mix of students of different abilities, and that some of them, like Edward R. Murrow, continue to be integrated not just in terms of education, not just in terms of skills level, but also racially and economically. And it's interesting that Sean showed that there's been a decline in the number of educational option programs.
Right, and I think the idea is to take that to the next level of not just looking at students who are at the top and the bottom in terms of exams, but really looking at socioeconomic status, looking at English language learner status, looking at students with disabilities, and creating integrated schools. And there's tons of research out there that shows that integrated schools result in better outcomes for all kids. So I think if you could design a system that really is doing that, that would be great. And just to say that I know District 1 and District 3 are really looking into controlled choice and how they can implement it in those districts, I think at the lower levels, elementary and middle school levels.
Sean, have you looked at controlled choice in places like Cambridge or other?
I have not. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm familiar a little bit with the literature in other places, but haven't myself.
Rob, do you want to, have you thought about that at all for the Department of Ed? Is that something on the?
I mean, I know that we've been talking to districts 1 and 3 about some of the concepts that they're interested in implementing. We'll continue the conversations, though I don't know what direction they'll take.
And 1 and 3 would be on the elementary school level, right? Is that?
They've been talking about both, I think, elementary and middle schools.
And middle schools, yeah, but not the high schools. I have one question I'm going to throw out to everybody, and then I'm going to open the discussion up to the audience. For everyone, would it be better to scrap school choice and go back to zoned, or just have zoned neighborhood schools?
Oh, I can jump in. I mean, I wasn't here before, so I can't say. But I know that when I've given this talk a few times on high school choice, and a comment that I always hear is that we don't want to go back to the way that it was. There's a lot of things that people don't like about the current system, but there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm for the way it worked before. I think based on this conversation and also reflecting over time on the work that I've done, I think there's definitely a smart way to move this forward. I think there's problems with the way it's set up now. It's kind of the Wild West, but there are definitely smart ways of informing kids, maybe something towards a controlled choice that would make it a little bit less the Wild West.
Carol, do you want to touch that one? No.
I definitely don't support going back, given where we are now. The landscape is too variegated. The size of the population is burgeoning, and it would be almost impossible. Quickly, I live within a block from what is now the Taft Educational Complex. When I went to Riverdale, many of my classmates had parents who taught in Taft, and Taft was full of diverse student body. That would not be the case. So if you had a local neighborhood school, now you would have a school that would probably be about 90% Hispanic, and of those, about 80% still in an English language learner capacity, and that would serve nothing. But we've got to work. The worst part, though, about the current system, which we didn't mention here, is the no exit policy. Since they did away with guidance transfers, if your child, unless that child's school becomes a quote-unquote failing school, if it isn't a love connection, you are trapped. It's almost impossible as a 10th grader to get school choice going through that process.
Rob, do you want to address that?
So
I call it caught in the bad romance.
again, here's where my street cred goes. So I think two things. One, I want to talk to the zone school issue a little bit, agreeing that I think if on some level integration and opportunities for kids outside of their neighborhood are things that parents want, which we all seem to agree they are, then locking them into a zone school option potentially diminishes that. It diminishes the diversity that can occur in a school, the types of programs that can be brought to bear for that school and that community. That said, is there a balance to be struck? Potentially. We have some great performing high demand zone schools, and we have some that are not so much, and kids want out of their communities more than anything. As to guidance transfers and how that has evolved over time, I think this is a conversation that we need to have. You and I had this conversation a few days ago, that we need to look at how we strike the balance between kids who ultimately are not succeeding and need opportunity versus parents and kids who are kind of like, well, I think I would have preferred my second choice over my first choice. And I want to experiment there for a little while and how we kind of, I hate the term, but how we gate those in some ways and make sure that we're focusing on the students who have the greatest need, not necessarily the ones who are just unhappy for a day because a particular peer group, you know, ostracized them for a moment or two, or, you know, some circumstance happened and they didn't make the sports team, something like that. So I think there's opportunity here to be flexible and to figure out what the balance is to be struck, though I don't want to say, let's open it up and just say everybody gets a guidance transfer whenever they ask for one.
I mean, I think there's just as we talked about, there's a bell curve of guidance counselors. Some of them are very talented and some of them are not. There's also, in the enrollment offices, you'll find a range, which is where you would go if you want to transfer. You'll find a range of people, some of whom are really knowledgeable and some of whom really know nothing.
Well, we need to work on that.
Yeah.
Can I just add a comment on the zone school issue?
Yeah.
I think, you know, I don't think we necessarily want to say we want to go back to zone schools, but I do think that geographic, you know, the fact that geographic importance is so important to families, that students shouldn't have to leave their community to find a good school. And so it's about, I think, looking at geographic, looking at districts, and making sure that within each district there are real options for students and that students can make choices within their geographic area and not be forced to go somewhere else to find a school that can meet their needs.
Could I ask just before we?
Yeah, I'm just, about the microphones, Tom and Dominique have microphones, and if you raise your hands and grab, you know, they will give you the microphone. One more, yes, go ahead, Rob.
I was again on the
John.
zoned issue. I think it's important to, like, going forward, it's important to remember that, I mean, there are many things that parents like, and Americans, New Yorkers like about choice, having those options available to them. But there's also many things that people like about their zoned or their neighborhood school, and the fact that it's in their neighborhood, it's their community, there's some traditional relationship with those schools. And so I think we have to respect both of those preferences. And as I'm thinking about this conversation, I'm thinking about going out to eat in New York, not because I'm hungry, but because I'm thinking the analogy of one of the best things I like about living in Manhattan is that I can choose from lots and lots of different restaurants. But I like to stick to the neighborhood, and I like to choose a restaurant within the neighborhood if possible. And then when I'm in the restaurant, I prefer the menus that don't have 600 items, but rather have a carefully selected menu of options that would work for me as someone with my tastes. And so I think there's some analogies there for school to provide careful information to kids, more than just here's what's available for you, but here's what someone in your neighborhood and circumstances could really benefit from based on the past experiences of kids in the same situation.
Well, one of the situations I've had when I've done focus groups with 8th graders in Brooklyn middle schools is they say, I don't know where to begin.
Knowing where to begin would be a great place.
Would be yeah.
Can I just add one more thing, just in terms of this question? I think I agree that choice is likely than the alternative, but for some families, it's no different than what it used to be, right? They are just going to the zone school. So we have to be really realistic about how this choice system is playing out and where it's not playing out the way we imagine choice should be. So for those families that is, you just go to your zone school because that's your only option, or that's the only option you think, or you come in over the counter, choice isn't, and that's why I go back to how are we evaluating success, or how is the DOE evaluating success, and it's hard with 300,000 kids, right? So you do use shortcuts, how many kids get their first choices and how many appeals, but we need to be a little bit more nuanced in evaluating the success of choice as it's currently playing out.
And also the way, I mean, I had a mother the other day who told me about going to the enrollment center, and she was told you can only go to your neighborhood schools, that's, you know, that the enrollment center was unaware of the high school choice process.
Yes.
Are we confident that she went to the enrollment office?
Now, Dominique, give the mic to this woman here.
I'm a retired high school teacher. I would refer everyone to read the new school report on school choice, especially the chapter called Collateral Damage. I taught in one of the large schools, and over the last 8 years saw a school that functioned well as
which
a
school was
zone
that?
school, Newtown High School in Queens. And functioned well and taught most of the students well and had a reasonable proportion of students from supportive and organized homes, so that the ones who came from the other type of home had a chance to be helped and to be raised up and to be educated. And over 8 years, the proportion of students who were sent by the DOE that could read at grade level and do math at grade level fell to 20%. And the organized and unorganized tipped to the point where the school didn't do as well. But we still graduated 53% in 4 years, which is a 30% over what they came in with, and still were blamed and called failing. And it breaks a teacher's heart. You read all they say in the papers and how we're vilified, but our hearts bled to see that happen to kids, because kids don't get a second chance. And you don't have 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 years to fix it. You broke it.
She's right. That's right.
Rob, as a public school parent, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I can't speak to the specific circumstances at Newtown. I don't know all of the circumstances, but I think that the realities are that in most circumstances, we're not sending kids to a particular school. We're allowing the students to make choices about particular schools, and they're either choosing or they're not choosing. And so to say that we're sending a particular group of students as opposed to a different group of students is part of how the process has evolved. I realize that has negative impacts on certain schools, and that's something we need to address, but you're right, we do need to act more quickly in fixing things.
Thousands of children.
Can I ask a question?
Sean, in your research, did you see an increased stratification as a result of school choice? That is, that you'd get more low-achieving kids, higher concentrations of low-achieving kids in one school?
I only did this as a first pass, and this was in the pictures that you saw of comparing the feeder schools to the first choice schools and the placements. And I didn't see an increase in stratification, but I can't say that I saw much of a decrease in stratification either. So there's already a lot of stratification across middle schools, and a lot of that persists into the high schools through the choices.
Okay, we're going to go, Tom has got the mic, so somebody give
I'm Jim DeVore. I'm the president of the Community Education Council for District 15 in Brooklyn, and more importantly, a parent of a child who just went through the process. As usual, Mr. Corcoran has made a serious and thought-provoking presentation. One issue is missing, though: the blatantly discriminatory practices that have been perpetuated by the DOE admissions practices. In particular, I refer to District 2 and its cohort of Eleanor Roosevelt, Upper Lab School, Baruch, to a lesser extent Millennium. By the way, I mean, these schools are overwhelmingly white and Asian, the 80 to 90% range, 80% range, in a district where the majority of the population, of the high school population, is minority. These schools have been created basically as little islets for certain communities, which have also blatantly excluded parents from other districts, like mine. For example, I don't understand how a school like Baruch, which has an affiliation with the CUNY, somehow is limited to a District 2 admissions policy. I'd like to know, and the statistics are even worse than what I'm saying. I've studied them fairly extensively.
So,
So the question is, how do you justify that, or to what extent? Basically, it's primarily, the person I'm asking is Robert Sanft, but also Sean Corcoran. To what extent did your research take those things into account?
so the question is, why does District 2 have its own high schools?
So the answer is that these admissions priorities have existed for a number of years. We need to look into why District 2 has admissions priorities, though these well predate me in this role. I don't know that I could answer your question and say we're going to remove those priorities necessarily. We need to look at the circumstances as to how that came to be, why they are the way they are currently, why the student population is the way it is right now. I can tell you matter-of-factly that these schools do serve kids from other districts as well, but it's something we should look into.
I mean, I can answer quickly that under Tony Alvarado, who's the District 2 superintendent 15 years ago, he got permission to set up a K-12 district. It was an experimental district to have their own high schools. And they found new spaces for their schools. They didn't use existing. So at a time when most of the K-8 schools, most of the districts just had K-8, District 2 had K-12. So that's the historic reason for it. It's also true, of course, that if you live in District 26, you can go to District 26 high schools, and people from outside District 26 can't.
Don't have,
Yeah.
it's almost, with the possible exception of 26 and Forest Hills, almost no districts have schools that are simultaneously screened and district limited.
That's true. Dominique has got, yes.
My name is Leo Casey. I am the high school vice president for the United Federation of Teachers. I don't think it's any mystery that when you have unregulated markets, they reproduce and even accentuate inequality. And when you create a high school admissions process, which is as complex, if not more complex, than a college admissions process, yes. It shouldn't be of any surprise to anybody that the parents who have the social and intellectual capital are able to do for their children what other parents cannot do. I think there are at least three major issues of evidence that we don't have before us today that we need to know in order to evaluate this. First of all, we need to know the percentage of the students who do not go through this process, primarily over-the-counter students. Very high concentrations of need, and where they end up in schools, because they're not distributed equally across the system. They're most invariably put in schools, low-performing, high at risk. Columbus High School at 1 year had literally a quarter of its enrollment sent to it as over-the-counter. We need to know the percentage of the students who have guidance counselors fill out the form for them. We need to know where those students are located, because I can tell you they're not located in some schools. We need to know what happened to those students. And while what Carol Boyd does is exemplary work in a school system that has a drastic under-representation of guidance counselors at the middle school level, it is simply unrealistic to expect that guidance counselors are going to be able to help all the students that need their help. Finally, we need to know how it is that high-needs students are concentrated in at-risk schools. This is not simply the magic working of the invisible hand of the market. There are ways in which the market is set up that does that, so that a Leon Goldstein High School, for example, which is an adopt school, will not get 1668-16 because it has so many kids applying to it that are at the top of their classes and they get their first choice. And then on the other side of it, we need to know what happens to all of those English languages and special education students that they are concentrated in those low-performing schools. I think the most striking graph of everything that was up there was the correlation between students going from free lunch middle school to free lunch high school. That the inequalities in this system are reproduced and accentuated by the way unregulated admissions are done in a market manner.
Rob, you want to reply?
So obviously there are some data requests that we would need to fill. As to how students are concentrated or not concentrated, obviously it is an outcome of both the admissions process and the over-the-counter process. And just to be clear, the over-the-counter process does differ strategically from the admissions process because it's placement of students in grades 9 through 12 who don't have the opportunity to participate in the admissions process because they've come in after the process outcomes have already been determined. And so it is a differing student population. That said, much of the data that I've seen around the over-the-counter students that are coming in demonstrates that there are a high number of students who also perform at a high level who move into this city and have opportunities to be referred to certain schools or gain entrance to certain schools, whereas a lot of the characterization of this population is frequently that they are all our at-risk students, our overage undercredited students, our students with disabilities, and our English language learners. That's not accurate. The reality is that we do have a mix of students. We have a high turnover of our student population in New York City throughout the course of the year, and plenty of kids coming in May through October before the process ever begins, and at the upper grades who come in across the entire course of the year. And figuring out where these students have the opportunity to go is somewhat a byproduct of attrition from particular schools, and it's also an outcome of what the admissions criteria are for those schools. Can we do a better job of looking at how to ensure that one school isn't impacted drastically over another? We need to look at this.
Carolyn, from your interviews with parents, did you get a feeling that a lot of guidance counselors were just filling out the forms?
No, I think there's a spectrum. So it wasn't universally that the middle schools that the middle and upper middle class kids went to, their guidance counselors were doing that much more. And there was one middle school where the PTA raised funds to cover the cost for a dedicated high school articulation counselor. So that's one extreme that didn't happen in the low-income middle school that I spent most of my time. But I think the guidance needs were also different. So one of the differences, or guidance counselors or even a parent coordinator would send emails to their email listserv of parents to say open houses, or these are dates, these are reminders. That didn't happen in the other middle school.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant to say is, are there guidance counselors who just fill out the form without consulting with the
So
child or the
I don't
parent?
think that that's widespread.
Not
I think
widespread.
it happened particularly with a group of recent immigrant kids whose guidance counselor wasn't bilingual, even though there were bilingual guidance counselors at the school. And the kids didn't turn in their application. So there were probably 20 of them at this one school. I didn't spend as much time in other middle schools. I was just trying to give a landscape of the fact that guidance does vary, but I think the guidance needs were different based on the family background, because for some kids that might be the only support they get, particularly the students whose parents aren't involved at all, whereas some of the higher income families, it was a bonus. It was additional. We went in to check to make sure they had things on the list, and the communication was via email. And I just wanted to give a sort of a spectrum, but I can't say how widespread. I don't think it is. I just don't.
And Sean, I think you had some number of the number of children who did not fill out an application. Was it 8%? Was that?
Oh, it was smaller than that.
Smaller than that, okay.
And it's difficult from the data that I was using to determine whether or not they had actually completed an application or not. I mean, there were kids in the database without choices, and I assumed that they had not turned in.
Can I just respond to I think that the issue about the Office of Student Enrollment placements that's happened is really important, and we haven't talked about it too much here, but we see anecdotally all the time. For example, we work with a community organization in Brooklyn that saw 50 new Haitian immigrant students arrive, and they were all placed at Sheepshead Bay High School. Sheepshead Bay High School had not traditionally been a school that took these population of students, but all of a sudden this summer, that was the school that those kids were placed in. And I think that we don't know what happens in the enrollment offices, but there's definitely direction that seems to be happening that says this is a school for these types of kids, this is a school for these types of kids, and I think that that's something that really needs to be looked at in this process, because I think it does shift the burden of certain student populations to certain schools.
And it might make sense, because then you could hire a bilingual Haitian English instructor at one school,
right? I mean,
rather than sending them all to different schools.
Well, and I think it's a very complicated issue, right? If you want to make sure that you're sending them to schools that have programs. Sheepshead Bay High School has a good ELL program. They didn't necessarily have a Haitian Creole program. They did hire, because of the students that were placed there, a bilingual counselor, but did not create a bilingual program. So I think that if you really are combining placing students and services, you have to make sure that you're actually supporting those services and making sure those services are created. I don't know that coordination truly happens.
Hi, this is Jackie Wayans from InsideSchools.org, and this question is mainly for Sean and Rob. I have the privilege of working with a lot of community organizations that deal with minority, low-income immigrant parents. And what's very interesting is that you have a number of, or a ratio of this group that will opt to struggle to pay for private school during elementary and middle school years, but then they want to transition into public school at the high school realm. And oftentimes these students do not get placement. And so my understanding is that there is a lower priority given to people coming in from the private school sector when they're applying for high school. Is that accurate? And are there any metrics to kind of follow track these parents or students that are coming into the system, into public school from the private school element?
So I'll jump. There is definitely not a lower priority for these students. The problem under which we tend to suffer is the responsiveness of those school administrations to actually help facilitate this process, to input student grades when they are necessary if a student is applying to a screen school, to provide timely teacher recommendations, and the information that the students actually need to gain access to public schools, or the public schools that they would ranked as their highest choices. We've had a ton of interaction with private school guidance counselors and administration about this, but we do continue to have some issues in terms of their responsiveness to the process, particularly when it means losing some of their kids.
I do know the case where someone was told at the enrollment center that they are given more priority.
So I would like to follow up with you about that case, because that is not accurate.
Yeah, I didn't see that. My analysis that I gave today was entirely kids coming out of the public system. One thing that surprised me when I first looked at the admissions data was just the sheer number of kids that are applying out of the private school system. And I didn't see a lower rate of placement, but it's also a very complicated group of kids, because you have, there are a lot of kids, it seems, in the private system that are applying for the specialized schools. They'll put maybe a backup school or two, and if they don't get one of those, then maybe they'll stay in the private system. And so it's hard to disentangle the wide variety of kids in the private system. That's a great question.
Dominique, could you give the mic to Norm there? Norm Fruchter, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
There's a column.
I'm awfully sorry. I was behind. The pole was between you and me.
Thank you. My name is Rob Bowen with Black New Yorkers for Educational Excellence. And one of the revolutionary things that I heard today was about Ms. Boyd taking or creating her own PowerPoint, showing it to the parents, and they understood it, and it was acceptable. And my question, or the question would be, why wouldn't the principal bubble this up to the DOE as a best practices example? 2 years ago, or maybe 2 years ago, Clara Hemphill gave a presentation across the street in the auditorium about the difficulty parents had negotiating this handbook for school choice. And so it's not an unknown concern. And here's a parent who addressed this concern, and it was effectively used, and Rob Sant has to come here to hear about it and say, I'd like to get a copy of that. It bespeaks one of the problems in our educational system, and it tickles me that we always use the business model, because in a business model, best practices would be bubbled up to the top. Also, in terms of information on about graduation rates and saying, oh, well, parents, when they see graduation rates are high, that's where they want to send their children. And that's kind of like a duh. And one of the other pieces of information that needs to be put there is, we know this is very important, is class size on each report card. And also the school population for these big schools, new schools, where you have one school and now there are 4 schools in the same building. What was the original capacity and what's the current capacity? This will empower parents with some knowledge, some real understandable knowledge of the kinds of situation that the students are in. Also, what would happen if you had a culturally relevant curriculum? On the statistics we saw, we're always talking about the Black population, the Asian population, the Latino population, and the free lunch population, which is a combination of all of the above. And we never talk about the lack of a culturally relevant curriculum. When students are taught that their history begins in enslavement, that becomes a problem. Also, discuss school choice, and this again goes back to Ms. Boyd. Why not discuss school choice in the 6th grade with students so it becomes part of their thought process? And another statistic, and this is the last one I would like to see, supplemental educational support. A couple of years ago, Commissioner Spelling said that only about 17% nationally take advantage of SES services, of those who need it. Why not have that on your statistical output, so that parents can see what the SES services are and how they're used in the particular schools?
Rob.
So there's a lot to deal with there. You're absolutely, you're absolutely correct. We need to figure out better ways to share knowledge, and it shouldn't come to a forum like this to do it. That's on me. I need to start figuring out how to improve that. Grad rates would seem to be something that we always should have been putting in the directory. As to why they were not put in the directory, I don't know. But they're there now. We'll continue to put them there, and we'll look for other information that we can supply to families. We do provide some information around capacity of programs and size of schools in the directory. Whether or not we can provide more. You were talking about the report cards and the directory, so we would need to look into what more information we can provide there. Part of the consideration, though, and we run into this problem, is that we're publishing the directory now for use next year by students in considering their choices, and then they're getting into school the following year. So the circumstances can differ from what we know now to then, though we try to mitigate against that.
I was trying to address a mindset that would say,
right.
For instance, if you put class size on a student's report card, then when the parent sees that my child is in a class of 35 students, and it's a failing school, and they recognize that their friend is in a class with 20 students, and that's a successful school, they'll begin to put 2 and 2 together and become a more informed and active parent.
I think we're going to move on to another question now. Yeah.
Can I just hit one more point? we have done a couple of things over the last few years to try and get information into parents' hands at an earlier date, including getting the directories into the hands of kids who are leaving 7th grade, whereas it previously didn't get to them until after the summer and they were into their 8th grade year. To create it that much sooner for them presents problems, obviously, again, because of the lag in time to consider it, but ultimately to give them the opportunity to start to review the directory over the summer. Whether or not they want to use their summer vacation to do that is anybody's best guess. But there are a lot of families we've heard from who appreciate that. We've also created workshops and forums for 6th and 7th graders to consider. We do postcard mailings and a lot of advertisement. We haven't been able to drum up as much support and participation as we'd like, but we'd love to work with everybody to figure out how to do that.
Hi, I'm Gail Robinson from Gotham Gazette, and I have a question. There's a widespread feeling among a lot of parents in the city that the decision about where you're going to go to high school is actually made in many cases as early as 4th grade, when you take the 4th grade test and it determines so much junior high school admission. So I wonder, Sean, in your research, did you look at all about whether there's sort of different tracks in the city that some kids in low-performing junior high schools find it very hard to break out of that and go to a high-performing high school, and kids in high-performing middle schools tend to go to high-performing high schools? And what, if anything, the city is doing to sort of address that concern that these kids are sort of put on a track when they're in 5th grade that it's going to be very hard for them to break out of?
That's a really tough question, and I haven't looked at it in a long arc way like that. It's tough, when you look at whether kids are applying to schools that are hard to get into or less hard to get into. It's hard to say that it was predetermined where kids were going to go. And so it's sort of a culmination of a lot of things. I mean, the kinds of schools that kids are attending in middle school, the kind of guidance counseling they're getting while they're there. They're not prevented, I guess, from getting into certain schools. I mean, a lot of kids are trying to get into really difficult schools to get into, but the modal kid in the school in the city is applying to a school that's not that hard to get into, and so they're not necessarily locked out. But I think you're right. There's a lot of things that happen along the way that influence where a kid is going to end up.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence that poor kids start kindergarten 18 months behind their peers in terms of reading and writing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, Carol.
Not only that, since you have done your research perhaps, okay, the New York City Department of Education used to run the Specialized High School Institute to provide extra enrichment to children to prepare them for specialized high school exams. In 2007, there were changes, and as part of this effort, the DOE actively recruited underrepresented students, so students of color, who normally would not be aspiring towards doing this. Changes now in the law in 2007 now prohibit the DOE from doing this. So this year, in fact, Specialized High School Institute had tons of seats that were left empty because there were children who might have benefited, but they weren't able to no longer attend.
Rob, is that correct, that they're empty seats?
So there aren't tons of seats that were left empty, but the way that the law changed was this change from a race-focused program to a socioeconomic status-focused program. We were required not to focus on the reasons that the program was actually created to address Black and Latino students, and ultimately to focus on Title I eligible students for the program, which shifted the demographic of who was applying and who was getting into the program. Though I can tell you matter-of-factly, we are looking at that program to figure out how we can improve it and how we can make it more accessible in different ways to a much larger student population. The program obviously has a math and science focus in the way that it has been administered over however many years that it's gone, and we've heard from tons of parents that ask us, why doesn't it focus on test prep? I think we need to look at how we balance those two in terms of giving kids greater opportunities to succeed on the specialized high school exam.
We have time for just one more question. Norm?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the issue of over-the-counter
students, because what we hear from a lot of closed and targeted to be closed high schools is that their jobs have gotten much harder given the percentage of over-the-counter students that they're assigned and don't have a choice about accepting. And we know, we have a lot of assumptions about those students, but as you pointed out, we don't know who they are, and most important, we don't know whether they're assigned equitably across the board to schools across the board, or whether they're assigned only to some schools and not others. And what schools have charged, and not only in this administration, but as long as I can remember, schools have charged that over-the-counter students are not assigned equitably, that some schools never get those students, and that a small percentage of schools get lots of those students. So 2 questions. One, Sean, can your research or your data shine any light on where over-the-counter students are actually assigned to? And for Robert, if the DOE published every year where over-the-counter students are assigned to, all of these mysteries would be cleared up, but there has never been transparency about where over-the-counter students are assigned to for as long as I can remember in the high school system. Could we get transparency?
Well, more data. And so, again, we need to look at the data and see what we can make available to you and how we would disaggregate it to provide information about how the kids are assigned. I think more to the point, though, we need to figure out how we improve our over-the-counter placement process and ultimately ensure that we aren't targeting particular schools or creating schools where they are almost entirely getting their student population over the counter. The 2 points are, yes, we can provide data, and 2, we can work with folks to figure out how to improve the process.
Can I make one suggestion on that? I think we looked at some of the international schools actually hold seats for over-the-counter students so that students can come after the enrollment process. The traditional enrollment process has finished, and so I think we could look at having more schools do that, and I think there's an issue of the budget, and the budget is finalized October 31st, and so small schools want to fill up their school and have those seats filled by that date. But if there can be more, a more equal distribution of these over-the-counter kids, I think that would be the way you'd have to do it, is have more schools hold aside seats for over-the-counter enrollment.
That's very true. And not only that, the fact is, and I have it documented from anecdotally with parents, okay, my current school has 12 seats that we always hold. If you walk into the District 2 Borough Enrollment Office and you request a seat in that school, they're going to tell you, oh no, they don't have room. This, and invariably, when you go into certain districts like 9 where I live, I've gone in there with families, to help them. What's left to you? Samuel Gompers, which is now persistently low achieving, or DeWitt Clinton. If you tell them, oh, I would like to attend Bronx Academy of Letters, which is probably one of the greatest schools in the Bronx, oh no, you can't go there now. There's no room for you. This is where you have to go. Take it or leave it. And the rationalization, and I was told this by someone in the office, is, well, we can't all go to school in District 2. Someone has to go to these schools and fill up these seats. I said, fine, let it be your child, because mine certainly isn't, and he doesn't have 100 years to wait for you to get it right.
I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you, audience, for coming.